I want to welcome all of you to the Republic of Consciousness Prize celebration for the 2022 long list. It's my distinct pleasure to have you join us. My name is Lori Feathers. I'm chair of the Republic of Consciousness Prize for small presses in the United States and Canada. I'm coming to you from Dallas, Texas, where I co-own the independent bookstore Interabang Books. And I also co-host the Books podcast Across the Pond, which some of the authors and translators here have been on. The Republic of Consciousness Prize, as many of you know, is an award honoring small publishers of literary fiction in the United States and Canada. This is our inaugural year. The prize was created in collaboration with Neil Griffiths, an award-winning novelist and publisher in the UK, who founded the Republic of Consciousness Prize in the UK in 2017. And I'm just going to hand it over to Neil to perhaps say a few words about the prize's origin and how well established it's become in the United Kingdom.
Hi there, everyone. Yeah, first of all, thank you for all turning up and for your wonderful books, which I've enjoyed reading enormously. It's very interesting to see. I'm chairing but not judging the prize this year in the UK, and they're a different set of books. I mean, small presses in different countries produce different books. We're not a homogenous bunch of presses. But anyway, yeah, I started the prize in 2017 because it was clear in the UK that there was this groundswell of great small presses that weren't necessarily getting the kind of publicity that the big mainstream, they're called the Big Five over here, were getting, and that a prize is a very good way of creating a certain amount of media noise, and at the same time helping independent bookstores sort of curating the best work from the kind of microculture of small presses. So booksellers know what books to get in, and it's worked out very well. You know, in dollar terms, I guess we've probably given out about $140,000 over the last 7 years, and we to about 40 different presses, and some people who have gone on to win other major prizes. But we certainly introduced books that probably wouldn't necessarily get a certain an amount of attention out there in the world, which is the aim. Small press publishing, as I know, I've only just started my small press in the last 2 years. It is not a get rich quick scheme, and anything anyone can do, get books into bookshops, readers to recognize the books, pick them up, check them out, read them, talk about them, is a good thing and makes a difference. And so that's what Laurie has done with the prize in the US, and that's a good thing. And I'm really privileged and feel rather blessed that something I started 7 years ago in the UK is now in my, I lived in the US for 2 or 3 years, and see it as a place I would rather live in, quite frankly, and so therefore my adopted country that I don't live in has adopted this. So that feels very special. So that's my bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. I think that you probably know that the aim of the prize obviously is to support small publishers for their ongoing commitment to work of high literary merit. And you may also know that our prize fund for the long-listed, our prize fund this year, our total prize fund for books published in 2022 is $35,000 US. Each of the long-listed titles that we'll be discussing here today, the publishers will receive a check for $2,000. The five books that advance to the shortlist will receive an additional $3,000 each. And then the winner will get bragging rights. And I totally copied the winner gets bragging rights from Neil, but I like that very much. It was always, I think, something that I liked about the prize in the UK, that it spread the winnings over a great number of publishers and books, and I think that's a good thing. Okay, let's see where we need to go next. I think next on the agenda, real quick, before we start talking about the books, is to let you know that the shortlist will be announced on March 14th. The winner will be announced on March 28th. So the judges still have a little bit of work to do. And I also want to make a quick mention that for those who are not affiliated with a publisher or a book that are on the Zoom today, we're going to have a drawing after the Zoom, random drawing, and the publishers have been so kind to donate 5 copies of their books for distribution. And so we're going to pick 5 names, 5 email addresses, and I'll send you an email where we can send you a copy of each of the long-listed titles. So thank you, publishers, for helping out with that. Okay, I think it's time to introduce real quickly our judges, and I'm sorry if I'm not going to be able to do justice to the really fantastic judges that we've had this year and their very impressive credentials, but I'm going to try to be brief. I'm first going to start with Michelle Malonzo. Michelle is the Chief Operating Officer at The Word, a storytelling sanctuary, a literary arts nonprofit that promotes storytelling and equity. Previously, she was a bookseller in Phoenix, Arizona, after nearly a decade in publishing. Next, we have Javier Ramirez. And let me get to Javier's. Okay, sorry. Hailing from Sacramento, California, Javier Ramirez has called Chicago home since 1995 and has been an indie bookseller for just as long. He's been a judge for Kirkus Nonfiction Prize, the National Book Award for Fiction, and the Carnegie Mellon Medals in Fiction and Nonfiction. He is the 2021 Director of Programming for the Printers Row Lit Fest and is the co-owner of the mighty XL in Bookville, which is a bookstore in Chicago. Next, Ben Fountain, perhaps needs no introduction, but Ben is the author of a few very notable titles, Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, and Beautiful Country Burn Again. He is the recipient of the Penn Hemingway Award, the National Book Critics Award for Fiction, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and a Whitting Writers Award, and has been a finalist for the National Book Award. And he lives in my hometown of Dallas, Texas. And finally, last but not least, Neil Griffiths, who we've already met, but I want you to know that I've already said that he's founded the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses in the UK in 2017, but he is also an award-winning author. He wrote the novels Betrayal in Naples, Saving Sarajevo, and also As a God Might Be, which was published in 2018. And he's also co-founder of Weatherglass Books, which is a small press in the UK. Now let's go on to the main event, which is to hear about and listen to our presses and our authors and translators talk about their long-listed title. So for that, I would like to go ahead and start with Neil Griffiths, who's going to lead the discussion on POLLAK'S Arm.
Oh, okay, right. Hi there. What a fantastic short novel this is. I'm currently reading it for the 3rd time. It's a novel about a real person. It's interesting. These days there are lots of novels which seem to be a real person. You Google them and they're not, and then you read something and you Google them and they are. And fiction does seem at the moment to be in this kind of hinterland where you don't know whether what you're reading is about real people or not. But this is a beautiful novel about, and tragic novel about a collector and catalogue writer of Roman antiquities and general antiquities, and with a love of Goethe, as he's talked out of his apartment to avoid him being taken by the Gestapo during the Second World War. I don't know, I'm not entirely sure who I'm talking to first. I can see Michael is there, who's the publisher, but I believe the translator is present, but I can't see on the screen.
Elisabeth Lauffer.
Hans Von Trotha, I believe, is here. The author told me he was just able to sign in.
Oh, okay, right.
I hope he's here. I don't see him. Oh, there, I see him. Okay, great.
Okay, well, welcome to you. Michael, I believe you're going to set up a reading that Elisabeth is going to do. Is that right?
That's right. So Elisabeth's going to do a brief reading. I just want to put it in context for you.
Yes.
So as Neil just said, POLLAK'S Arm is a novel based on a real person, someone who's now little known in the English-speaking world. He's Ludwig Pollak, an archaeologist who discovered the missing arm of the Laocoon sculptural group, which is the fabled artistic masterpiece from classical antiquity that's now in the Vatican museums, that was unearthed during the Renaissance, and its finding electrified Michelangelo and his contemporaries. Pollak was a Prague-born Jew and was unable to pursue an academic career. So he went to live in Rome, where he worked as an antiquities dealer and an advisor to eminent collectors like the Emperor of Austro-Hungary. The book opens in 1943. Darkness descends upon Rome. We're inside the Vatican, where a Monsignor summons to his office an envoy that he sends to a nearby palazzo, the home of Ludwig Pollak. He wants to offer Pollak and his family refuge in the Vatican to spare them certain death on the next day, when the Vatican already knows that the Jews of Rome will be rounded up and dispatched to death camps by the Nazis. But when the envoy arrives at Ludwig Pollak's house, he refuses to make haste and depart. Instead, he insists on recounting his life's tale, expounding about his passion for Italy, his love of Goethe, of classical antiquity, and his belief, perhaps fatally mistaken, in the enduring power of art and civilization in the face of barbarism knocking at his door.
Thanks for that intro, Michael. And thank you, Neil. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you to all the jury members. It seemed Pollak was trying to avoid or ignore my call to alert his family and prepare. He had moved to the window and stood there like a figure seen from behind in a Caspar David Friedrich painting, the fading light of a rainy fall afternoon providing the backdrop. I had clearly failed to convey the urgency of my mission. Either that or he chose not to acknowledge it. I didn't know what to do. When I set out for Palazzo Odescalchi, it had never crossed my mind that our talk might drag on. Danger was at hand. It was obvious. I thought it must be obvious to him too. "Is that the car?" he asked. "The driver just got out. He's coming inside. He's in uniform. SS." Those words revealed Pollak's fright at what he saw, but even so, his response was far more muted than seemed appropriate to me. Nevertheless, I felt a momentary hope that the shock might remind him of what was happening and bring him to his senses. I informed him of our cover, assured him that the uniform was no cause for concern, that the driver was loyal. To us, that is. I went to the other window and watched the driver below. He approached the building, then disappeared through the tall gate between the pillars of the Baroque facade. The vehicle looked abandoned on the street. A moment later, there was a knock on the door to Pollak's apartment. Though we knew who it was, we both jumped. "Shall I get it?" I asked him. I walked down the corridor and opened the door. The driver whispered that he could not wait on the street much longer, or at all once the sun set. He gave me an address a few doors down and around the corner. He would wait there in the courtyard. He too implored us to hurry. "Doctors, midwives, and priests are exempt from the nightly curfew," I said to Pollak as I returned. "I am none of those things. For that reason, we have to hide the car, and we have to hurry, At whatever cost, we must make it to the Vatican before nightfall. Pollack appeared indifferent to the conversation I had had with the driver. He was more interested in the make of the car. He was still standing by the window. He must have seen the driver leave the house, climb back into the car, turn around and drive up the street. I don't know, I said. I'm not sure. Mercedes? Strauss had the same one, Pollack said. The very same one. Could that be? Or was that too long ago? Strauss? I asked. He interpreted my involuntary response as an invitation to continue his story. I have guided many, many people, hundreds easily, through the collections of Rome, the major private collections in particular. No one has ever known them as well as I. People knew that in Europe, but not just Europe. Please, have a seat, he said for the first time, gesturing toward the bookcase and a table with armchairs positioned at either end. I politely declined and stood demonstratively near the door. He did not sit down either, but remained where he was by the window. Then he told me about J.P. Morgan. J.P.M. He spelled it in English before pronouncing the full name in exultation. John Pierpont Morgan. His Majesty, the Dollar King, Pollack called him, then said he had been pleasantly disappointed by the encounter. He enjoys lobbing little barbs like that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we don't have a huge amount of time. So really, I suppose one thing I will say, with the renaissance of small presses, certainly in the UK, and I imagine to a certain degree in the US, the quality of translation of literary fiction, I think, has been more than 1 or 2 or 3 10-step changes up, and I think this is an example, along with Damion's translation of Jon Fosse's work, of a piece of work where one feels no wrong notes, and that it feels like it's written in an English language. But this is so flooded with detail, this piece of work. What degree did you have to kind of wrestle with all of the detail, all of the life of this extraordinary character, the people he knew, the people, I mean, it's a question for the writer as well, but I think in a way the writer will have done the research. But as a translator, do you have to do that as well, do you feel?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words. I was thinking about this earlier, in fact, about the amount of research, and it's one of the great joys of translation, because you may be translating different projects at the same time and taken into totally different worlds, where certainly, I mean, Hans spent time at the Vatican museums and libraries and speaking also with experts and doing so much research on his own years of research, and it's all distilled in this book. And so for me as the translator, there is a lot of looking things up. I mean, really, ultimately, it ends up being a lot of Google. But one really helpful resource was a catalog that Michael lent me during the process of translation, which was of, I believe it was the archive, the Pollack's archive. Michael, I don't quite remember what that was from.
It was an exhibition at the museum that Pollack was the director of for a period. Hans, the name of the museum begins with a B, the Barak. You need to unmute Hans, Laurie. Can you
Hans, can you raise your hand in the okay, hold on. Let me see if I can find.
Michael, how did you discover Hans's book?
I was sent it by Wagenbach. They thought it was something I would like. We published another book by them. I read it in 2 days. I absolutely devoured it. It was thrilling, totally engrossing. I really had known nothing about Ludwig Pollack, and the story was it's such a strange mixture of erudition with on your edge of your seat suspense, and it's so rich on so many levels, dealing with the Holocaust, with classical antiquity, with cultural history. And it also is a book that is very relevant at this moment, when Pollack and people around him believed that somehow their education and their civilized being would somehow protect them from the horrors of Nazism. And it really relates to the situation which is going on in Ukraine right now, which I think Hans can talk about quite eloquently as well. So,
I think
Elisabeth, had you already translated it when Michael read it, or did you read it in the German, Michael?
I read it in German.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Hans, are you able to speak to us, Hans?
Yes. Do you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for the reading. Thank you very much for the invitation. And just to catch up with what you said, it's enormous experience as an author to realize how valuable and how authentic and how clear a translation can be. It again was very touching for me to hear this text, which is, of course, Liz's text, not mine, but my story. And it was a great collaboration. And also, Michael's work as a publisher was amazing and is. So that the English translation has a completely different life than, for example, German.
Hans, there's an echo in everything you're saying.
Do you have two mics on, perhaps?
Actually, no.
Phone nearby?
Hello.
Now is there's the echo.
It's one of the vagaries of Zoom. It'll be a mic that's, or something's just feedbacking from another something.
Yes.
Can I just ask about have you read Uts by Bruce Chatwin, Hans?
Yes, I have. Of course.
Because there is I mean, there is, in a way, there's no similarity and a remarkable similarity. These are short novels about people who just want to collect Meissen porcelain in Utz and a number of things in your novel, but it does speak to some very eccentric human behavior, I think, the completest, if that's translatable, the completest notion that some people have, that they must go out into the world and make sense of it by collecting things. Is that something that you recognize in yourself?
Myself, it is a little bit. It's basically it is collecting stories, and that is why when I heard about Ludwig Pollack's story, this was a story that didn't leave my mind for several years before I considered writing a novel. And then it was clear it has to be a novel, because I wanted to not reconstruct the biography, but the story behind it, and the various layers of that story. So, and the other Bruce Chatwin association, I didn't have it actively, but as you say, it's also the concentration on a room, on rooms.
Yeah,
that is the other thing, to have the rooms. It's two rooms in the novel, and they echo the story. And that is something I had in mind and did. And then, there was a lot of research, but even more work was to find, and so we're back to the translation, a tone, a language that would allow to do that, what I was trying to do. And I was really impressed how possible it was to transfer this language into another language, into English, as it did.
I mean, I think it's just to finish, I think it's a extraordinary creative success in form, and both in storytelling and in and its translation. So I loved it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Hans and Elisabeth and Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. And Hans, particularly you, it's very late for you.
And sorry for the delay and for the echo. Something technical wasn't right. And thank you very much for the invitation.
We're thrilled that you're with us. Thank you. Next, we're going to have Judge Michelle Malonzo speaking about a public spaces nomination for the long list. And that is God's Children Are Little Broken Things.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, it was not allowing me to unmute myself, so there was just some back end. I'm Michelle Malonzo, and I am so excited to talk about God's Children Are Little Broken Things, which I have been reading since it was a rough-bound manuscript when my dear friend Cristina Rodriguez, who used to be with APS, was like, you have to read this. She sent out a mailing to all of us, and then we were on this texting thread about how does this book exist? It's so beautiful and daring and breathtaking. So I'm so happy to be here to discuss it with you, Megan and Ruby. This collection of short stories set in Nigeria really tackles with love, desire, queerness, masculinity, and the tension that exists between who we want to be, who we are, and who the world tells us we should be. And I really kind of want to, I guess we start off with a passage that is going to be read. Megan, are you taking that? Yay. Sorry, I was ready to dive into the questions because I love this. I love these stories so much.
Okay. Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Lori, Neil, everyone. I was speaking with Arinze Ifeakandu, the author of this beautiful book, beforehand. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but I asked him if there was a passage he would most like one of us to share. And he asked that I read the opening of a story called Where the Heart Sleeps, which is one of the early stories in the book. And it is an absolute honor for me to share his beautiful words with you. Where the Heart Sleeps. 2 weeks after her father's death, Nonye returned to the house in Lucky. The evening she arrived, Tochukwu met her at the gate and helped her with her bags. He was a slim man, and when he took off his glasses as he asked about her trip, his eyes looked dim. He plucked a hanky from the breast pocket of his blue shirt and began to wipe his glasses, his motions gentle, almost like petting. His fingers were too slender for a man. She told him her trip was fine. In the living room, she stood and stared at the high ceiling. It was the same gleaming white, the ceiling, and the chandelier shone softly golden. The curtains were drawn over the large arched windows, blocking out the waning sunlight. She remembered that the curtains used to be taupe, not this deep shade of gold, but could not remember, although she tried hard to, whether the changes had already been made when she last visited 2 years ago, whether she'd simply failed to notice. I prepared your old room, Tochukwu said. I thought you'd like to stay in it. They walked upstairs. The paintings on the walls were the same, abstract. They looked childish to her. She used to marvel at how much her father spent on art. Only one of the paintings had any intimation of something real, the colors spiraling into the shape of a man. She remembered being absolutely terrified of walking down the stairs at night if she needed something from the refrigerator. In the dim light reflecting from the kitchen below, the man had seemed full of colorfully expanding eyes into which she could sink and never be found. It was Dubim's favorite, Tochukwu said, noticing her pause. At first, I didn't understand it, didn't understand any of the paintings, to be honest. He laughed. She could sense his discomfort. slight and well preserved. He was a man with his edges tucked in, but there nonetheless. She wanted to be kind, to laugh with him, but all she could think about was the stirring in her chest, an old and pulsing resentment. He must have sensed it, because he said nothing else. In her room, he pulled her bags into the wardrobe. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, stepping out and easing the door closed. She went to the window, parted the curtains. Something felt lost, missing, the space right outside too vacant. And it took her a moment to realize that the cashew tree was gone. It had been there the last time she visited. She was certain about this because although she didn't sleep in the house, she'd always come into this room to smoke. She pulled the curtains closed, sat on the bed. This was real, she thought. She would never sit with her father on the veranda, never brush a leaf off his hairy arm, and he would never again ask to smoke with her. She'd come here to feel him, to see his fingerprints scattered all over in the decor and the paintings, into Chukwu. And now that she was here, she was no longer certain feeling would be enough. When she had looked at Chukwu earlier, she'd not seen her father. She'd seen a man helping her with her bags, a man with his own look and voice and walk. What she really needed was to see them together, to hear what her father's laughter sounded like with Chukwu in the room, to experience the man he became when they were together. To do this without feeling like a peace offering, a compromise spread between this and the house in Ikoyi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. The language is so beautiful in these stories, and there's such a fluidity to it because it's also moving across different languages. There's Igbo, there's English, and there's not, and it plays with the meanings behind a lot of that, but without any sort of like direct translation. I think American publishing really likes to over-translate, even in English, unnecessarily so. And I am just curious, one, how do you edit for that? And also, why was it so important that you keep that fluidity of meaning and connotation within the stories?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. So I was Arinze's editor for the book, and early on in the editing process, we spent a lot of time on Zoom, talking about his vision for the stories, and we talked a lot about the language. And I knew right away that I didn't want to ever encourage him to translate or explain something that wouldn't be translated or explained to a reader in Nigeria. I didn't want him to write toward an American audience. I wanted him to write the stories as he saw them. And so we had a lot of conversation about language, and I sort of spent as much time as I could familiarizing myself with with the Nigerian dialects, the languages, the politics, the geography. And as I spend more time with the book, I just, even from the beginning, actually, his writing draws you in so completely that even if I didn't know what a phrase meant, I found I didn't, I didn't think I could still sort of understand because the characters, I felt like I knew them so completely. And, as the editor, I did, Google, I did sort of go on Google Translate, and I did have conversations just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And our copy editor as well, but we really trusted Arinze to just tell the story using the voices and the languages that he wanted. And I think it turned out just so beautifully.
I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. I also really enjoy how we're pulling back the veil. And yes, everyone uses Google. I mean, just It's like this mysterious process, and you're like, actually, I Googled it. I enjoy that immensely. And I think the other thing, this is such a gem of a work. Like, when it came across your desk, however, in whatever iteration, what was it about it? Was there a particular story? Was there a particular nuance that you were like, this is what makes this collection unique. This is why we must publish it. This is why this voice and these stories need to be out in the world for readers to discover?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question, because I feel Arinze as a writer has been so important to me in my career as an editor. I started at a public space about 10 years ago as a reader, actually. I read submissions. And one of his stories, a very different version of which is in this book, came across my pile of submissions, and I just absolutely loved it. And we didn't end up publishing that story in that form then. But I remember it was one of the very first submissions I read that I was just so excited about. And I passed it up, to the editors at the time. And we ended up encouraging him to apply to one of our writing fellowships. And so he was one of our 2015 writing fellows. And then in 2021, his agent sent us his manuscript. And I feel like I just knew him already so well as a writer. And I had conversations with Bridget Hughes, our editor, about acquiring the collection, which we did. And then I, was lucky enough to be the editor assigned to the book. And so really, I feel like Arinze's career as a writer and his career with the public space has really spanned my career there as an editor as well. And it's just, I feel like I've, in a way, grown along with him as a writer. But just like from that very first moment I saw that very first story 10 years ago, it just, the language, it's just his beautiful, gorgeous sentences. That's what I remember most when I first read his work all those years ago, is just that gorgeous language.
Oh my God, I love that. I love how full circle that was. That's so special. And then this might be a blasphemous question to ask, but it's the last question. What is your favorite story in the collection? I know that's a horrible question to ask, but I'm asking.
You're all so beautiful. I feel one of the stories, the story that I just read a bit from, Where the Heart Sleeps, I think is a gorgeous story about a daughter who has never accepted her father and his life with a man after he left her mother, and coming home sort of too late, but wanting to accept that, but still feeling that, resentment. And, in the end of the passage I read, that feeling that, it wasn't enough to come home to just tochukwu. She needed to really accept, to really understand, to try to come to terms with her own feelings. She needed her father to be there, and he wasn't anymore. It's a beautiful story, and it just comes to a very beautiful ending as well. I think that might be one of my favorites. Maybe that's why Arinze asked me to read it. Maybe he could tell it was one of my favorites, but.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan. Thank you, A Public Space. We love this so much, and it's so great to be able to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much.
All right, because it is, I don't know, going on, I guess, 1 a.m. for Neil, we're going to let him take the next title as well, which is a new name, Septology Parts 6 and 7 by Jon Fosse. Take it away, Neil. Well, I'll try.
Hi, so I can see Damien's there.
And Adam is here as well.
Where's Adam? Okay. I can't see Adam, but
Adam Levy.
okay. Well, I'm going to. So, do you want to unmute Damion?
Here I am. Hello.
Hi, Damion. I noticed in the chat you said, can I say at one point why I called the prize the Republic of Consciousness, which I think actually is relevant here. I just had this idea when I was reading something about neuroscience, that somehow that on some deep level or we will never know another. And basically, I think what literature does is make consciousness permeable. That's what it, you know, we are let into other people's consciousnesses through literature in a way we're not through the visual arts or music or whatever. Consciousnesses are just, I mean, you know, you have stream of consciousness or whatever, but consciousness are there on the page and we are allowed in and whatever. And it's a slightly mad type name for a prize. I know it's slightly ridiculous, but I did it. I set it up in the morning, and no one told me not to do it. But yeah, so people will start rather sick and tired of me saying how much I love the Septology trilogy. I read it in the 3 sections. They were sent to me by Jacques from so I read them in the Fitzcarraldo editions, obviously in the UK, and there are the 3 sections there. I'm now watching people walk around with the huge Septology full deck. So the question I want to ask actually about the translating of it is that my reading experience, each time I got a volume through the post was, oh no, let me start with the first volume. Initially I thought, not another single sentence book. Zone had come out, and then there was Duck's New Report and whatever. And so that was my first initial thing. And then I suddenly realized that as I read each volume, I needed the first 50 pages to wrestle with it, because it felt as though I had to make my way into the world. And then it just became a kind of flow state experience. But it always took that little while, because it feels as though it's doing something that no other fiction is doing, and therefore one had to orientate oneself to understand. And then the moment that happened, the moment you give into it, maybe it's a bit of a wrestle at first, but when you give into it, it's a kind of flow state experience. And it's not like actually any other single sentence book. It's not like any other book. It's a book of dusk and tones and quiet and voices and loss and age and extraordinary things. But it must have been, I imagine, a very difficult book to translate, to manage that kind of flow state, the slow flow state of his slow writing, but to keep it buoyant somehow. Got to unmute him.
Yep.
I got muted again, but then again couldn't unmute myself. Sorry about that. Thank you for saying all those wonderful things about this book. I wonder if Adam's in the same situation, if he can jump in or if he can't jump in. Ah, there you go.
I can jump in.
Do you want to?
But I'll let you go.
Oh, okay. You know, I had translated quite a few other books by Fosse before by this point, so it wasn't quite the, you know, jumping in the deep end that it would be if I or if you were reading it as the first time you'd been in this mode of his. The books actually are kind of different, even though they do have a lot in common in terms of the like intensity, and not all of them are the single sentence thing. I think the single sentence thing is in some ways almost a misleading way to put it, because it's not one sentence, it's just put together with commas and ands instead of with periods. And also there are long passages of dialogue that do break it up, and so it's not you know, it's actually a bit less of a gigantic block of text type
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
than Bernhard or Lucy Ullman or something like that. When I've done readings, I've sometimes picked a passage that kind of emphasizes this much more traditionally novelistic kind of, you know, getting the characters in some scene that is illuminating. Fosse is a playwright. He's, in fact, most famous as a playwright. He's the most produced playwright alive in the world. So,
wow.
like, no one alive has had more productions of his plays. And so, like, he knows how to do a scene, and he knows how to, like, create stuff going on with just dialogue or incident.
Are you going to read a bit?
Let me just read a short bit. This is our main character lives a pretty solitary life, but his neighbor Aslak has convinced him to come see his sister, Aslak's sister, for Christmas, and so they're taking the boat, Aslak's boat, to see Aslak's sister. And meanwhile, our narrator has found himself now the owner of a dog that he's had to take care of because the owner is incapacitated. And this dog is named Bragi. So they're getting on the boat. Then I hear Bragi bark. Mustn't forget the dog, Aslak says. Yes, Bragi, he says. That would have been bad, I say. And I go open the back door of the car, and Bragi hops out. And I slam the door shut, and then I go over to the boat, and Bragi follows me, and he looks scared of the boat. And then I pick him up and hand him to Aslak, and Bragi whines and whimpers and whines. And Aslak takes him and puts him down on the deck, and Bragi lies right down. Then he's lying there shivering and looking up at me with his scared dog's eyes. Doesn't look like much of a ship dog, Aslak says. He's lying there shivering and whimpering so low you almost can't hear him, he says. And I untie the front mooring, and I throw the rope to Aslak, and he coils it up nicely, and then he lifts up the front fender, and right away the boat starts to drift away from the dock. And Aslak says, we're lucky we have the current with us. The trip up Signafjord goes much quicker with the current than against it. It can take almost twice as long if it's running against you, Aslak says. And I untie the rear mooring, and I coil the rope as I walk towards the boat, and I hold tight to the rope so that the stern of the boat is right up next to the dock. And Aslak holds the boat close to the dock too with a boat hook. And then I step down onto the gunwale and then down onto the deck, and Aslak shoves off with the boat hook, and right away the boat moves out into the water, and already we're a few feet from land. And off they go.
Right. The painting, there is a painting sort of at the center of this. It's one of those strange things about writing, I think, is that the painting is present and often described, and one can always see it in one's mind's eye, but perhaps however gifted one was, never paint it. It's almost, it's just a cross, isn't it?
Yeah, so this, each of the 7 parts sort of opens with him kind of considering at various stages this painting. And it's just 2 lines that cross in the middle, that's it. They're painted with thick oil paint in different colors, so they've sort of run and bled together in the middle. But it's an extremely, beyond abstract, it's simple, and so simple that he, the painter, doesn't really know what he thinks of it. Is it even really a painting? Is it done? How can it be done when it's just these 2 lines? And so, you know, this is a book about a lot of kind of crossings, and also there's a lot of Christian religious themes in the book. So the cross of the 2 lines, I mean, it's a horizontal format painting with diagonal lines. So it's not a straight cross, it's called a St. Andrew's cross. You know, it's so simple that it has these resonances as you go through the book in various different ways about different characters or different, you know, husband and wife or the church or God and humanity or whatever it is. But yeah, it's so abstract and simple and almost not there that it can kind of accrue all this stuff.
Yeah, because in a way it's because there are, you know, there's part of the Catholic liturgy is in the book, and which is, you know, in a way that kind of paradoxical, very kind of both mystical but also incredibly regulated religion, and then you have this painting which is almost nothing but somehow everything at the same time, because it as you say, it sort of kind of gathers in meaning through the whole of the I mean, what was it? I mean, was it a tough book to translate given how odd it gets at certain places?
Yeah, you know, I actually remember, I forget if I actually heard the painter say this or if I just read it somewhere, but I have somewhere in my mind this anecdote of someone asking like a professional painter when they're old, like, how long did it take you to paint this painting? And their answer is, you know, well, an hour or 50 years, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's nice. That's like a really good one-liner for art, that that it's not hard like building the Great Wall of China, but it's also not easy. As Joe Brainerd says, it's medium, you know? So I think that partly, I guess, because I've done multiple books by Fosse, it's not like a grueling task to translate him, but I still think that there's some kind of cross between skill and like attunement to his work that, you know, not everyone would have if they sat down to translate it. So it's not automatic or easy in that sense.
No.
But you know, but I wouldn't say, when I was listening to the earlier questions about like researching all the stuff, like there's very little stuff to research in this book. You know, it's just very stripped down and simple. Like I had to look up what the difference between a gunwale and a fender was on the boat, but like that's about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Adam, do you want to add anything to this? Although you're muted. Oh, you're muted as well.
Yeah. No, he's coming.
There you go.
I'm here. Yeah, I think I had, you know, Neil, I had a very similar experience with them because we also read them in single volumes. And actually at first, when we first got the book on submission, we maybe had 20 or 30 pages. I can't remember exactly.
Probably the scene in the playground with the swing.
It ends at the playground. Yeah.
I love that scene.
It's a really great scene, and I feel like that's one especially where you can feel Fosse as a playwright kind of firing on all cylinders there, and also why it can be misleading to think of it as a single sentence book. And we started, I think when we first were talking about the first volume, we were talking about how it was this big book, a single sentence across the three, and pretty soon we stopped talking about it because I think it was really giving people the wrong impression of the kind of project it was or the nature of its ambition, which I think is really quite different from, you know, that single sentence kind of project. Although I do like the way that they keep each book touches down with the, and I see myself standing there looking at the painting. I feel like I started doing that for everything in my daily life. I would just be like, and I see myself standing there in front of the refrigerator looking at the leftovers and the other leftovers. And there's a way in which that kind of incantatory rhythm really does feel like recognizable. Sometimes, yeah, a really lovely reflection of that consciousness. What was I really going to say?
Well, it's partly just to jump in about the length thing. You know, Fosse has very specific kind of instructions to his Norwegian publisher about how they publish it in terms of like margins and font size and stuff. So the books are extremely long in Norwegian. And so this was sort of part of it, that people were talking about it as this 1,500-page book. And then once I got into, or series, you know, all three of them. And once I got into them, I was like, well, this is the longest and it's like 300. So I think it's down to like 8 or 9. And, you know, the one volume edition ends up being what, like 700 and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you don't have to talk about it as this like monumental 2001 A Space Odyssey slab kind of thing. It's just, you know, a book or 3.
But at the same time, it is nice to have that, or sorry.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, it's nice to have that durational aspect of it too, where you do really need to slip into it, because I similarly had that experience anytime a new volume came in, where I would kind of wrestle to find that rhythm. And then once you hit it, it really does feel like something you can just ride out the rest of the way. And it really is an other reading experience in that way.
Yeah. I'm sure we're running late, Laurie. I do apologize. So we need to move on. Thank you both.
All right, thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to be talking to author Robin McLean and her editor, Jeremy Davies. And we're going to talk about And Other Stories nomination for the prize. It's the short story collection, Get 'em Young, Treat 'em Tough, Tell 'em Nothing. And let me just make sure that we've got Rob set here. Robin, Jeremy?
I'm here.
Great.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, guys. I guess we'll start off, Robin, asking you to read a short passage if you don't mind.
I do not mind. I would, I'm very honored to be here. And Neil, I love the name of the prize, so don't change it ever. I'm gonna read the end of a story in the collection called House Full of Feasting. It's, Jeremy wanted me to read this one, so I do what he says. And it's a weird ending, and we figured that this was the right crowd for this reading. What's happened in the story so far is a young, beautiful, ambitious American young couple, Prince and Mimi, have just acquired a farm from their former landlord via murder and trickery. And they're gonna pay for it in the last scene via some weird American farm equipment. And we are going to enter the scene with a bullfight because Prince and Mimi play sexual games throughout the story. And one of them is to have bullfights with each other. So the bulls at the beginning of this story and a little ways in are Prince and Mimi, our beautiful American landowners. The last bullfight was on the rim of the pond. This was November. The pump was quiet since the new seedlings were still 2 seasons off. The bull seemed sluggish, tampered with. It pawed the ground out of obligation and tossed its dizzy head. Its black eyes rolled, ran at the cape, oblivious to the water below, the life proceeding there. Ducks watched the bullfight in flotillas, resting their wings, though their migrational flight had hardly begun. They skirted islands of slush and froth mixed with leaves. They bumped late lily pads, dipped their heads for minnows. The flock parted in V's, for floating objects, barn trash, and junk thrown into the pond from cars. Then a sound, a shiver on the water's surface. The ducks knew it, lifted up, and flew south. Then the pond began to boil and steam. Pipes appeared on the surface, twisted and kinked. The pump on shore coughed alive. Something large lifted its rusty head from the water, larger and larger. It periscoped up from the center of the pond. Water dripped like oil from its coppery mouth. The neck craned up, link by link, the head 50 feet above the pond and shrubs, stretching up as if to peer over its land, its houses, to watch its sun go down, to bow to deserving comrades, the silo in town, the tall tree on the hill, to dry itself, to stretch its blades and tracks over freezing mud. Then the head turned. The pair was far below, on all fours now, one on one, two nipping beetles. The head dropped. The jaw cracked open on rusty hinges. An empty belly knows no blame. Prince saw it coming. It didn't matter. The teeth were saw blades, splintered and bolted. The tongue was crusty, impervious to the small complaints of minuscule fists, for example, or tiny heeled feet kicking as the gullet swallowed. The head tossed the second meal, lurched to make the catch, down the hatch, a little salty, a fishy flavor, caught for an instant in the riveted throat, and the head shaking with a joy of hunger briefly satisfied as the slow grind commenced.
Wonderful. It's a wonderfully bizarre collection of stories, and I say that with the most compliments, Robin.
I love it. Thank you.
We've talked about this collection, you and I, a few times, and I remember asking you about the narrative arc in each of the stories and how the characters change over time. These are short stories, but you can see an evolution in the characters, I think. And you told me that you when you were thinking about writing the stories, you cared less about what's a resolution for the characters than about how the stories make the reader feel, that's your main focus. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you want the readers to feel when they're reading these stories?
Well, I think reading should be an experience. And I think that the books that I love and the stories that I love, I've got a visitor here who's going to get at me during the whole reading. Come on, you can come up. I want to experience writing it, and then I want the reader to experience what I experience. Sort of, it's a puppet show, I guess, in some ways. But I'm, as you know, Lori, or thank you for the judges who have read it. I've seen some friends out here too who know this book. This is a book very much about America, American thinking, about capitalism, about oppression. And it's pretty much the stuff that I don't understand. And so I write stories to try to understand what befuddles me. And so probably I hope the reader also feels befuddled and also feels outraged or happy or whatever it is that's going on for me in that experience of exploration. That's what I'm hoping for.
For me, you succeeded. I think for a lot of people, you succeeded. My next question is for Jeremy. Jeremy, the situations that Robin places her characters in in these stories are quite unconventional. And I wanted to ask you, do these bizarre situations that you confront as an editor, do you feel like that gives you more or less latitude as an editor in terms of thinking about how the readers are going to react, how you want the entire collection to kind of fit together?
I think it gives you more. I mean, Robin will attest that I'm really terrific at giving bad advice, which is to say, letting authors or encouraging authors to take their most sort of misanthropic impulses and really running with them. And that's what one of the things I really love about Robin's work is that the circumstances in them may be unusual, and certainly there's stories that involve crime and all sorts of things that you hope an average sort of bourgeois life wouldn't necessarily contain. But the feelings in them and the people in them are very recognizable, at least to me, as sort of American types or characters that are then taken to particular extremes. And there's always a vein of perversity in them that to me is a joy to sort of tease out. So in a sense, to my to the detriment of my career, I think, but to my joy as a reader, I tend to try to get Robin to lean in even further to those elements and keep them pure. And that's what drew me to her work in the first place. That's what shocked me out of my editorial jadedness when I first started reading her.
That's great. Keep leaning in, guys. Okay, we're going to go on to the next title. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, Robin. Thanks for being with us. Next, we've got Ben Fountain, who's going to be introducing us to The Sleeping Car Porter, which is Coach House Books submission.
All right, Suzette, this is a wonderful book. It is a novel without flaw. It hits every point: character, pacing, tension, the stake, world building. You have just nailed it throughout. And I salute you. And Alana, thank you for publishing this lovely book and publishing it in such a beautiful way. There is a gentleman wearing a beautiful pink suit on the front, and I want a suit like that. Anyway, Suzette, so why don't you go ahead and read a bit from this wonderful book?
Sure. Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be here. I'm seriously really, really honored. Okay, so I'm going to read a passage in which the sleeping car porter of the title, who goes by the name Baxter, reminisces about his former sleeping car porter instructor, a man whom he has a big crush on. And the book is set in 1929. Slinging along metal tracks in his luxurious prison, somewhere between Medicine Hat and Calgary, Baxter thinks about Edwin Drew. Mr. Drew in his finely cleaned and pressed monkey suit, sailing around like a king of England with his precise pronunciation, his brain a full set of Encyclopedia Britannica, as he showed the new porters, all stuffed into the off-duty car, how to make down and make up a berth, how to fold a blanket exactly by drawing the blanket from the foot to the head, how to shake the curtain to quietly wake up a passenger who has to detrain in the night, how to use the whisk broom on a male passenger's jacket, an ostrich feather duster for cobwebs, how to sponge then dry off a washstand without leaving smears or blots or cloudy patches, the code names for different kinds of vermin. Mice are diamonds, rats are sapphires, roaches are rubies, and bed bugs are pearls. How to deal with ladies having lady issues, how to deal with men having men issues, how to deal with drunk passengers, make them drunker, declared Mr. Drew, and he winked at Baxter while all the student porters laughed. How to deal with passengers who've had too much to drink the night before, how to deal with a disorderly woman or sporting girl plying her wares on the train, how to calm down the sleep talkers, the sleepwalkers, how to know the time it takes for a train to travel from Chicago to Smith Falls or from Duluth to Sault Ste. Marie, the infinite number of protocol crimes that could earn demerits, such as disloyalty, dishonesty, the use of intoxicating liquors or frequenting of places where they are sold, immorality, insubordination, incompetence, gross carelessness, untruthfulness. The infinite crimes that could earn dismissal, such as disloyalty, dishonesty, the use of intoxicating liquors, or frequenting of places where they are sold. Immorality, insubordination, incompetence, gross carelessness, untruthfulness. How to look in the little instruction handbook with its cardboard covers they all have to carry if they have questions about the rules. Edwin Drew had a wide, clear face, sported wide shoulders, and Baxter wondered if he engaged in calisthenics. But when Baxter took a turn to show how he knew how to make up a berth, he had to shove the lower mattress into the upper berth and shove the berth back into place with all his might, sweat pouring down the sides of his head, his eyeglasses sliding down his nose, skating down the nervous moisture. He suddenly understood why Mr. Drew's shoulders and arms wielded so much power, how he swirled and folded sheets like a bullfighter and snapped up and snapped down the ponderous, heavy berths from the ceiling as though they were made of cloud. Thanks.
You really construct an entire world for us in this book. It is the world of the and you obviously did your research, quote research, but then you did something else which is much rarer. You took that leap from factual knowledge, and beyond that, knowing what your character is going to do and say and think, at a certain level. But you went that step further and you got into the nerve endings of your character. And I mean, this, as Robin was saying, this is an experience, being with this gentleman Baxter for the entirety of this marathon train trip across the country. So I'm going to ask you if you can, I'm asking you to explain the ineffable. How did you do it? How did you go from knowledge to getting into the skin, into the nerves of Baxter?
That is such a good question, because that was the hard part. The research was it was difficult in itself, but then I had all the research, I built the world, and then I thought, where's the story? Who's the main character? And I think what ultimately did it for me was for a long time, the sleeping car porter of the title was just a hypothetical person. He was just, he was an idea of a person. And I got so desperate that I decided to just do some time travel. And I thought, what if I was a man in 1929 in Montreal who was a sleeping car porter? What would I be interested in? What would I be passionate about? And I thought, I really like reading weird fiction. I like reading eerie fiction. And I thought, well, probably I'd be reading Dracula. I'd be reading, The Beetle by Richard Marsh. I'd be reading weird tales. I would be maybe understanding, the passengers in an unusual way. And so, what became really important was making sure that this character had a passion of some kind outside of the job of being a sleeping car porter. And so when I was able to figure out what he wanted and what he desired, the fact that in early drafts of this text, he was actually a straight man, he was a heterosexual man. And then realizing that I'm a queer person, I'll make him a queer person, and just bring him closer and closer, that just inhabiting him and figuring out who he was, then lots of things started clicking into place. And I think it's partly because I'm also a character-based novelist. I'm not so much into plot. It's sort of like I build the characters, and once I've figured out the characters, I can put them together in a room and see what kind of chemistry or sparks happen. And that's sort of where story comes from, I think.
Well, you succeeded splendidly. This is a novel, among other things, a novel of suspense. And there are two ticking clocks in this novel. One is Baxter is saving for dental school. And if he can save $1,068, he will have enough for 4 years of dental school. but competing with that is the demerits clock. And if you achieve 60 demerits as a Pullman car porter, you are fired. And right now he's got 50. And so is he going to get to $1,068 before he gets to 60 demerits? And he's a little over $100 shy of that. And so, I mean, that tension, it's kind of maddening for him. And anyway, if you could just talk about that element of suspense.
Actually, Alana Wilcox, my editor, is here, and it was her idea. I mean, I had the demerits there, but it was Alana's idea to have that really kind of sickening countdown. So having the exact numbers in terms of how much money, how many demerits. I don't know, Alana, if you want to jump in at all or not.
The math was hard. But yeah, I felt so intensely that you love Baxter so much when you're reading the book that you just want him to get there. And so those two competing pressures, I don't know, I think help drive the story. It wouldn't have worked if Baxter wasn't so compelling and so real.
Yeah. And I mean, it really is an existential, crisis for him. And I just want to say, I've got one more question, but before I get to that, I just want to say the ending of this book is just, it is just extraordinary and wonderful and totally out of the blue. And so hats off to writer and editor for that. I smile whenever I think of it. Last question is, I was wondering, how does Baxter not go crazy? Because he's in this pressure cooker in every way, of a situation, just the physical closeness. He's exhausted. He can't go to sleep. It's a marathon. It's supposed to be a 96-hour journey, but because of a mudslide, it stretches on beyond that. And then finally it struck me, actually, he goes crazy about 1 million times. He has these micro bursts of insanity, but he always pulls himself together. And then I thought, well, actually, the whole train goes kind of crazy. I mean, there is every manner of human depravity and vice and weakness on the train, and nature itself goes crazy with the mudslide. So, in fact, Baxter is the sanest, person in the book. Am I getting that right?
I would say that's absolutely right. He is terribly, terribly sleep deprived, and the longer the trip goes on, the more and more he starts to hallucinate. But he also, I think he's been doing it for so long, he understands that it's a kind of organized kind of madness, this sleep deprivation. And I think you're absolutely right that, everybody in this train they get a little bit stir crazy and they start to lose it. But it's his job to keep everything going, right? That's his job. And so maybe, there is a section where he sort of cracks and becomes a robot, one of the robots he's been reading about. And I think that he does at a certain point become an automaton kind of figure. And I wonder if maybe that, it's really hard to know, because all of the men who were working as sleeping car porters in the 1920s, they have passed on. But I wonder, I didn't make up the fact that they only got maybe 2 or 3 hours a night if they were lucky of sleep. And so I wonder if they maybe had to flip some sort of switch in order to do that job. I think the job was absolutely just the demands and the conditions, the low pay, everything it was a ridiculous job. I think you'd have to be a little bit crazy to be able to do that job and stay healthy, if that makes sense. Yeah. So hard to say.
The sleeping car porter is a tremendous achievement. And
thank you very much.
It is just a wonderful book. So congratulations and hats off.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you, guys. Okay, next up, we've got Javier Ramirez. He's going to be introducing us to the $2 radio nomination, New Animal.
Hi, before I introduce Ella Baxter, New Animal, I just want to thank, first of all, Neil for introducing this amazing prize in the UK, and for Lori being brave enough to bring it over to the US. And also to all the writers, translators, and publishers who are here tonight. It's an amazing list, and we had so much fun bringing it to this point. And lastly, but most dear to my heart, I want to thank all my fellow judges, Michelle, Ben, Lori, and Neil. It was a lot of fun doing this over the last year or so. So thank you, guys. Thank you all for doing this. New Animal by Ella Baxter. It's published by $2 Radio. Eric, Eliza, and Brett, wonderful people. If you don't know them, you should get to know them. I absolutely love this book, and to be honest, not a pink suit, but a really cool pink cover. So Eric and Eliza sent this to me months before I even knew this prize existed, and it quickly became one of my favorite books of 2022. And Ella, one of my favorite new voices. And I'm so honored to be talking about this book. I'm gonna quickly, I know we're running short of time. I'm just gonna ask a couple of questions. And thank you, Ella, for writing such a wonderful novel. Death is a common theme throughout New Animal, given the family business and immediately losing her mother early in the novel. But some heartfelt humor is always lying in wait to keep the novel fluid. Was it difficult, Ella, to keep that in balance in order to not have it become too dark or too humorous? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say it just took a lot of rewriting, really. I mean, I went back after it was published and saw that there was 138 versions of the book. So I think it took a long time to find her voice. And then it took a long time to kind of work out the relationship between her and death and her and the living, because I really needed them to be quite separate. And yeah, it took ages. It took years, if I'm honest. But I mean, I had worked kind of death adjacent for a while too, because I make death shrouds for the funeral industry. So to me, death had kind of come down off the pedestal, of the mysterious, dark pedestal, and been quite comfortable for me to like interact with for a while through my business. So yeah, I think that helped a lot.
At one point in New Animal, Amelia explores the idea of kink and BDSM as a way of distracting from her grief. Ella, was that evident in the first draft of the book, or was that something that you cultivated as the novel took shape? It's one of the scenes in the book that involved this is one of the funniest and most heartfelt moments I've read in a long time, and it made me laugh and feel so sorry for Amelia at the same time. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, yeah, no, it wasn't in the early versions of it at all. But I used to live alone, and I used to go to this wine bar and have a drink alone. And one night I was doing it, and there was this other woman there at the bar drinking alone, and we started chatting, and she was a dominatrix. And we spent the rest of the night talking about the homogenization of kink. And I realized that there was a lot of interesting kind of similarities between what she was saying about the kink community and what I felt like was missing from Amelia's experience of her body in that kind of really rampant stage of grief. And so it kind of came together, it folded in together from that point on. But yeah, it was an interesting exploration, and I didn't know it was going to go there, but I feel like sometimes you're kind of just piggybacking on the characters, and you have to let them kind of jog you into these landscapes that are a little bit interesting. Yeah.
Did you want to read a little bit?
Yeah, I can read. I'll be quick because I know
Thank you.
I don't want to waste anyone's time. But thank you again for having me, and it's been so lovely hearing all the other authors and publishers speak. It's a real treat. Okay, this is where Amelia is really wrangling with the disconnect between her body and her mind. It's kind of in the middle of the book. I used to think my body was special because it could withstand a lot. I walked my body into parties it didn't want to be at, made fun of it, filled it with smoke and alcohol until it bumped into walls. I let it be laughed at. I made it get haircuts it didn't like. I made it be polite, sit up and behave. I jumped it off rocks and pushed it into rivers and happily let it hit the water too hard. I left my body out of decisions, ignored it when it didn't feel right, hated it when it didn't work. It could have been on Mars for all I cared, it could have been dead. What else? I let myself remember. What about when I've loved it, fed it vegetables and kept it warm and safe? When I put soft things around it, let it sleep more than the usual amount. When I checked if it needed glasses or vitamins, when I used my body to care for other bodies, when I untangled knots with gentle hands and ignored my phone, when I took it for long walks, ran it like a dog, sank it into warm baths with salts, when I listened to it give the first gentle no of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. That was awesome. And again, I'm so excited. And it's just, I'm really excited to see what comes next for you. And good luck with the future novel. I know, I think I know what it is, but thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you to Dollar Radio. Okay, next, Michelle is going to talk to Sara Booker, who's the translator of Blood Red, which is Restless Books nomination. And let me unmute everyone. This muting thing has not been smooth.
Hi.
Hello. Let me get Michelle here with us. Here we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lori. And thank you, Restless Books and Sara, for being here. Sara Booker, translator of Blood Red, who has translated actually several books that I adore. Most of Cristina Rivera Garza, Jawbone, the list goes on. So this is, I'm very excited to have you here. It is hard to describe this book outside of this book is told in the kind of stream of consciousness. It's a book about excess, about a woman, her body, lust and desire, and all the bodily fluids that go along with it. I feel like it begs the question of what does it mean for a woman to have full autonomy over her body and over her humanity, and what does it mean to make choices with little consideration of the consequences. I think we get a lot of stories about men who get to do that, and I found this so refreshing and captivating, sometimes disgusting in the best of ways. So we will start off with you reading a selection from the book, and I'm waiting with bated breath as to what that selection is going to be, frankly.
I thought I'd start just from the beginning, just to avoid having to give a setup, or although I think you can kind of jump in wherever and get a good sense. But I like the rollerblades and everything at the beginning. So I'll read the first page, a couple pages. Well, first of all, thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you everybody for being here. So Blood Red opens. We rolled into the warehouse, spraying spit that glittered amid an uncontainable excitement while the night seeped in through our skirts and sleeves. Hands smelling of menthol and eyes vibrating with a dazzling intensity. Keeping our skates on, we entered and started dancing frenetically, trying to embrace the untouchable or unnameable while pouring ourselves out among the crowd and the noise, an intense beautification of everything. We felt as if we were just one body, bone, blood, flesh, that momentarily splits apart to come back together, pulled by the irremediable need for touch. We grabbed each other's hands and waists and long, blonde, black, golden, red hair. Our rhythms were synchronized, and every now and then our lips touched, our breasts brushed against one another. In one of those impulses to flee that strikes in moments of greatest pleasure, flashing from my tailbone up my body, I skated toward the bar, ordered a whiskey, and grabbed the hands that were at my side. Hands that were familiar and eyes that felt like accomplices, even though I'd only ever seen them once or twice. I slipped in the sweat of that body, smelled it, and pulled it outside, back onto the street, to skate again in the open air and experience the night as a black volute that attracts unstable bodies within its reach, showing no mercy to those who ask for help. The sentence outside as the night echoed inside me, and I skated. Holding that hand, I spun a few times, getting dizzy, grabbed a taxi, drank whiskey, skated down a street plastered with dog shit, scrambled over chunks of sidewalk, and arrived at the door of a little house on a dead-end street. Pasajeache, hawk, hole, horror. Then I calmly studied his eyes anew, eyes that didn't avoid anything, not even that which didn't interest them or didn't seem the least bit useful. His eyes traveled over everything. And while that fearless gaze roved over the disorder of the world, it discharged sparks that impregnated the air and objects with an almost shameless tenderness. I stood there, between the wall and door, shivering, my arms twisted, freezing to death. He started undressing me while opening the door to the garage, then the metal door, then the wooden door, and he was pushing me toward the humid, warm interior, into which I placidly slid, a little worried I was still bleeding. I'm going to end it there. I think I just wanted to get to the blood.
How perfect. Thank you so much. So the power you have as a translator, not only to make a story accessible to a whole other audience in a completely other language, but also the power to change a story based on the words you choose. How were you able to translate this, considering it's so explicit? It's so, and I say this with respect, I think, we need to have different connotations for words. It can be so gross. It in so many ways. Did you think at all about how it might be alienating the reader? Did you think about the reader at all? How did you go through this process?
I'll say I think I blushed more translating this than I have with other maybe not every other project. I do tend to like this kind of work. And I think that's part of the point of this book. I think it's partly to kind of make you blush and to call attention to these things, blood and other bodily fluids that we don't normally talk about or put in literature. I think word choice is really important and trying to maintain that explicitness, but without going over the top. So my wonderful editor, Allison Gore, who's not here, but she and I definitely had some back and forth about vocabulary choices. And the biggest one we went back and forth about was, in Spanish, the verb penetrar, to penetrate, is used quite a lot. And Gabriela uses it a lot in the Spanish to kind of explain exactly what you would think it would mean. And so but penetrate sounds very clinical in English and kind of awkward. And so there definitely was a lot of back and forth about like, how do we, the physical description, I think, is really important. She also, this character is also afraid of holes. So like holes are another image throughout. And so I think that this verb penetrate is really important, but sometimes in the context, it sounds really awkward. So there was a lot of kind of discussion of what word choice to use to kind of get at what she was getting at in the Spanish, but also to make it work in English. And was I worried about alienating the reader? Not particularly. I know
I don't expect this is a book that everybody is going to be drawn to, but I think that's the case with a lot of literature. I don't think every book is for every person. And so I definitely didn't want to be careful for the reader or hold anything back, I think, for the reader's sake. I mean, because Gabriela didn't do it in the Spanish, so why should I do it in the English?
I mean, I love that. I also think that's why small presses are so important, because I tend to think bigger publishers try to keep the reader more in mind than maybe they should, frankly. So, and then because I know we have time, I'll just give you one more question. And usually with authors, I love to ask them, what were the books they were reading while they were writing their own book? And I have a friend who's also a Latin Americanist and a translator. And, you know, in talking with the author, they were like, oh, please read Jessie Ball. I want you to translate kind of like this. And so were there any books in particular to like help you through this translation process, especially one that made you blush as much as it made me blush and wince?
That's a good question. I wish I had a good answer for like a sort of, I guess, a comp title. The book that I did intentionally read for this is Pascal Quignard's. He's a French writer, and now I'm forgetting the title of the book that I read, but this is an author that she really, really likes. There's an epigraph for him, and I think she draws a lot on kind of his concepts of love. So I definitely, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the title of the book that I read for this. But it feels like kind of an unexpected choice. Like it's totally, totally different from the intensity and the explicitness of this book. I think just a lot of the other writers that I like tend to overlap a lot. I mean, Mónica Ojera's work, I think, the writers aren't necessarily in direct conversation, but I think they're responding to similar kind of cultural context, similar literary contexts. They have been in conversation now that their books have both been published. So Mónica Ojera actually did the launch event for Sanguínea in Spanish. So I think she's another one that I was thinking about a lot with this translation.
Well, this is such an incredible work in such a small space. Like, it is a short novel that really punches you in the throat in the best way possible, but it is. And thank you so much for the work on this. Like, really, when you think about the art of translation, this book really made me think about the art of translation in this book. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to the readers.
Thank you, Michelle and Sarah. Next, we've got Ben, who's going to introduce the short story collection, Moldy Strawberries, which is the nomination by Archipelago Books.
Right. This is Moldy Strawberries is a lovingly published short story collection by Fernando Abreu, a Brazilian writer who died in 1996, and translated by Bruna, Dantas, Lobato. It's just a lovely book in every way, inside and out. Bruna, if you would read a passage from the book, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Ben, for introducing the book, and to all the jury, and also to all the presses. I am very devoted to small presses, so this feels really special. Thank you. I will read, I was going to say a paragraph, but it's a prose block with nothing. So I'm going to kind of arbitrarily stop after what feels like a paragraph from a story called Beyond the Point, which is one of my favorites. It was raining, and I was going into the rain to meet him. No umbrella or anything. I was always losing them in bars. I was holding just a bottle of cheap cognac tight against my chest, Hard to believe it said this way, but that was how I was going through the rain. A bottle of cognac in hand and a wet pack of cigarettes in my pocket. At one point, I could have taken a cab, but it wasn't very far away, and if I took a cab, I couldn't buy cigarettes or cognac. I thought hard. It would be better to get wet because then we could drink the cognac. It was cold, not that cold. It was more the dampness seeping through the fabric of my clothes, through the holes in the thin soles of my shoes, and we would smoke, would drink without limit. There would be music, always those hoarse voices, that moaning sax, his eye having settled on me, the warm shower loosening my muscles. But it was still raining. My eyes burned cold. My nose started dripping. I would wipe with the back of my hand and the snot would harden quickly over my nose hairs. I shoved my reddened hands deep into my pockets and I was going, jumping over puddles with frigid legs, so frigid my legs and my arms and my face that I thought of opening the bottle to have a sip, but I didn't want to get to his house half drunk, breath stinking. I didn't want him to think that I'd been drinking, and I had been, every day a good excuse, and I was also thinking that he would think I was broke, arriving on foot in all that rain. And I was, stomach aching with hunger, and I didn't want him to think I hadn't been sleeping, and I hadn't. Dark circles under my eyes. I would have to be careful with my lower lip when smiling, if I smiled, and I almost certainly would when I saw him, so that he wouldn't see the broken tooth and think I'd been letting myself go, and I had been. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. You conjure a very strange and haunting and lovely sound out of the English language on these pages. And I've got to believe you are tracking a sound you're hearing from the language in Portuguese. And if you could tell me if I'm right or wrong. And if you would just talk about, I mean, everyone says and knows that, translation is so difficult. It's so difficult to catch the sound, the nuance of another language. I've got to believe with this book, more difficult than most, because it seems like so much relies on tone and mood and attitude. So if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I think this book is harder than most. I mean, it was for me, it was very difficult, but I think if you think of it as music, or, the metaphor goes that the translator is a pianist interpreting a score, there is a sense of a melody that I could follow and a sense of the drama. I could hear where there was climax, where there was action, the rise and fall, where the sentence sagged, and I could replicate that. So that even a lot of the stories don't have a lot of plot, like in this one, it goes on for quite a bit. This person is walking in the rain, and that's pretty much the entirety of the action. But it feels really fast paced, and there's a lot of forward momentum there. So if I keep that going and I keep, the musicality of it and the way I hear it, it can sustain itself pretty well. But then if I falter, the whole story pretty much falls apart. It doesn't work as a story anymore because the drama is going to be off. So what I just had to do was to read it out loud in Portuguese, read it out loud in English, see if it felt the same way. I got similar sense of closure, similar sense of action. It was a really fun process. Different books demand different things out of the translator. And this one taught me a lot about translation, I think. It was a very special book to work on.
Yeah, it's a special book to read. There's two kinds of stories here. I mean, you do get classic stories in the sense of beginning, middle, and end, a recognizable narrative. And those, for the most part, show up in the second section of the book, Strawberries. Whereas in the first section, I mean, the settings are, okay, there's this unsettling juxtaposition between abstraction. I mean, most of these people don't have names. They are not in a specified place. And we aren't even sure, what era we're in. I mean, although we can guess, we're more or less in the modern era. And yet the sensory specificity, like the bodily sensations, the concreteness of the immediate world, that's what anchors us.
Mm-hmm.
And then, another anchoring factor are all the substances: tea, coffee, wine, booze, cigarettes. I mean, you could call this the Republic of Cigarettes. I mean, the cigarettes keep us tethered to, reality as much as anything. So to me, you are walking a tightrope there, especially in the more abstract stories, of how to keep the reader tethered into a particular kind of reality without losing us, but also doing justice to Abreu's stories.
I loved Sarah Booker's comment about not worrying too much about the reader. I feel similarly. I didn't worry too much about that because I felt that the consciousness, the Republic of Consciousness, I suppose, the consciousness of the characters was so clear, their state of mind, even in their confusion, it was so consistent that we could trust that experience. We could be in that smoky haze with them, or we could be under the influence of LSD in the next chapter. And that was the experience. The artifice of it, was so, he pulled it off so well. The illusion was so profound that it was fine. It was fine that sometimes we didn't know where we were. We knew where we were all along. It was in that person's mind, and that was okay with me.
Yeah, and just thinking about the place and time he was writing, Brazil under this brutal military dictatorship. I mean, I imagine it was, certain modes of behavior and artistic expression were quite dangerous. And so it's safer to inhabit this abstract.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think a lot about like the evasion or alluding to something else so that it's not actually said in the book, the way he talks about drugs sometimes, or the way he talks about sex and gender, sexuality, and he never uses certain words. He never talks about AIDS, but we know it's AIDS. And he never talks about queerness, or even uses a word like homophobia. There's no need. It's very much in there. It's everywhere. It's just not explicit.
Yeah. And I just want to say 2 of the most wonderful stories I've ever read are Pear, Grape, Apple, which is, pretty much the craziest psychotherapy session I've ever sat through, and heartbreaking and lovely. And then there's those 2 about, an office romance. And anyway, it's just a lovely book. So hats off to you for this beautiful translation, and to Sara and Emma for publishing it. Archipelago has been doing great work for a while, and this is yet another example of this, devotion to the literary arts. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to be talking to Martin Riker, Danielle Dutton, and Sarah Booker about new and I've lost my track here. New and Selected Stories by Cristina Rivera Garza. This is the nomination by the Small But Mighty Dorothy, a publishing project. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This collection is so eclectic and very interesting when you look at it. And I was particularly struck by the fact that the stories here collect Cristina Rivera Garza's stories from over the course of 4 decades. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what it was like to put this collection together and how you kind of approached and shaped a project as large and ambitious as this is for covering 40 odd years of her writing and thinking life.
Yeah, I'll take this one. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for putting this together. And I just want to add that it's just such a pleasure to see so many old friends on a single Zoom. Yeah, this is a very special project for us. It was very collaborative, which is always the best thing. We had published a novel by Cristina, The Taiga Syndrome, and we knew we wanted her to be a more significant part of our list. We only publish 2 books a year, so we don't generally have like a lot of repeat authors because we just don't have that much space. But there are certain writers that we definitely want to have back, and Cristina was one of them. And we knew that she had a number of books of stories in Spanish that hadn't been translated. So we actually approached her and approached Sara Booker about the idea of doing a book that would not just bring the stories into English, but also sort of make a narrative of her development stylistically and philosophically over the years. And they were both very much game for it. And then Sara, I'm actually going to hand this over to you, Sara, because you really took the lead on figuring out what stories to use and that kind of thing.
Yeah, this is a really fun project, and like you say, really collaborative. The 3 of us worked very closely together, and also with Cristina was closely involved. And I think there are kind of different phases of the selection process. So I did an initial, I think I came up with a list of probably double of what we actually ended up including of possible stories. And I remember writing kind of descriptions of the different stories and some rough translations. And we kind of went through and picked out which ones we thought would work. We tried to pick select stories kind of from each of the collections to get this sort of chronological arc. I think we had different iterations of how we were going to organize everything. I think we tried more of a thematic or a genre approach first, and then took this chronological approach that I think works better. But I think we were looking for stories that worked on their own and that were representative of, in some way, of these different periods in her life, which sometimes meant we had to make some tough decisions. And then I know we were also pulling from, there were a number of stories that were already translated and translated beautifully. So we were able to pull those in as well. And then Cristina came in as well. And I know there were a couple stories that I wanted to include that she didn't necessarily want to include. And there were, and then there were a lot of from this kind of more recent writing period that she was doing that have not been published in Spanish that we included, and a couple stories toward the later in the production process that she introduced.
Yeah. So the volume ended up being exactly what we'd hoped it would be in terms of showing this sort of trajectory of her career, but it also surprised all of us. And actually, most interestingly, it surprised Cristina. I think she hadn't really thought about her career as having stages the way that it very clearly did once it was all sort of assembled. So
I do feel though, when reading the stories, there are some, of course, themes. I mean, they're not, it doesn't feel random to me. I think there's a theme that I picked up or thought about was just precarity. There's in almost all of these stories, I think, I can't think of an exception, there's this feeling of like a threat or an unsettling kind of feeling. And I'm familiar with some of Cristina's previous work as well. So I know that that's kind of something that she writes, and she writes very well. But I don't know, when you were thinking about what stories to include in the collection, did you think at all thematically?
I mean, I feel like this is Sarah's better to answer this question, but yeah, like she said before, we were thinking of organizing it thematically, but it just didn't make as much sense. We kept trying, and then finally, I think I was the one that was like, nope, we're doing it book by book and we're going in chronological order. And once we did that and made those hard choices and cut some stuff out, it became really clear, you know, that like that arc and that trajectory of her career became very clear to all of us. And like Marty said, even Christina was sort of, I mean, I think she was actually quite moved that we all wanted to spend so much time with all of these stories, some of them 30 or more years old, and that what resulted was like had such cohesion and made this strange sense to her. And she even wound up deciding to translate some of the newer work herself. Like she got really involved, I think, once she saw how interesting the book had come to be as a project.
Yeah, I think that she, in her introduction to the collection, she calls Sara her accomplice. And and I would have to think that's a little bit intimidating for a translator to have the author translating some of the stories as well, since Christina's fluent in both English and Spanish. I'm wondering if one of you wanted to read a short passage from the book.
I can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I will say I've never felt intimidated by Christina's kind of translation work. From the very first translation project we did, it's always been really collaborative, and she's incredibly generous. And I've learned a huge amount from translating with her, and it's been a lovely relationship.
It's great.
But I will read. I'll kind of jump around a little bit in the story Reincarnation, which is, I believe, in the last section of the book. And I'm going to jump around a little bit. So it's a story told in one like sentence line, fragmented lines. So she had seen herself at his side as they walked by the foyer mirrors. They were a sad couple. Foyer mirrors are frequently beveled. The affliction was and was not in their garments, a sky blue sheath on her body and a light gray suit on his. The affliction could be heard in the ringing of her heels on the marble floor. The affliction is a matter of an excess of order. Is the affliction the same as heartbreak? Surely she had wondered that before. I do not know what he might have wondered. If instead of going to a party they had stayed home alone, without a doubt they would have cried. Without a doubt, that phrase frightens me. Is sadness the same as the affliction? The man could not believe she would repeat the words of a fortune teller. The woman had already explained to him the difference between a riddle and a reincarnation. Something will be said. The man would have preferred that she were a sleepwalker. If she had been a sleepwalker, he could have saved her from the precipice. Sleepwalking women tend to wear long white dresses. You talk in your sleep, she had assured him, somewhat bellicosely. To afflict is a verb that comes from the Latin affligere. To afflict refers to both physical suffering and moral torment. A demand. I want my perceptions to change me. I think that gives just a little bit of a taste of the story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a good selection to read. Thank you. Our final publisher and title to be discussed is the story collection Family Album, which was nominated by City Lights Books, and Javier Vermees is going to lead us in that discussion.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Lori. I'm going to talk about Family Album, stories by Gabriela Alemán. And thank you, City Lights Books, for publishing this. And I think Dick is still here, one of the translators, and some folks from City Lights are still here. This is one of 5 short story collections, I think, that we put on the long list. And I would have been honored to talk about any one of these. These were amazing collections, each in their own right. But this one, especially, it's not even 100 pages. And I feel like every story was a long novella that I wanted a little more from. It was like they were, 8 to 12 pages. It was like a reading a House of Leaves short story. It looked bigger on the outside than it was on the inside. And it was such a joy to read these. So thank you so much. I just have a couple of questions because I know it's getting late. So Gabriela's time as a journalist becomes pretty evident in the overall structure of the stories collected here. Was that something that Gabriela was going for from the start? And I guess also to the editors and translators, did it help with the process?
Let's see. Elaine Katzenberger had to leave, and Gabriela's not here, so I think I'm carrying the ball here, unless Natalie wants to jump in at any point. One thing that I'll channel Gabriela as much as I can. One thing that Gabriela had said about the role of journalists in her stories is she's pretty attracted to noir, and the profession of private investigator doesn't really exist in South America, and so journalist is kind of the stand-in for that. And she's been a journalist herself, and I've been a journalist myself, so it all kind of fits together that way. But it's that person that tries to piece together, and I've been a detective novelist, so it's that person that tries to piece together the truth when everyone around them is telling half-truths or misperceptions or their own perspective or their own subjectivity or lies. And I think that although these are very different characters and very different narrators, yeah, that is a kind of thing I think that holds it together and that comes out of Gabriela's perspective on the world in that way.
There you go. Okay, I just had to unmute myself. Sorry. So just one question, and maybe we'll have a read, because I don't know if we'll give a reading. Maybe Dick will give a reading, but I'll have one more question, and we'll get to that. I run a bookstore that, and this is sort of piggybacking on this discussion about Christina's collection. I run a bookstore that gives just as much music attention to music as it does to the written word, and I've always thought of short story collections as albums. Musicians take great care in which track goes first and which is last. How difficult was it to create a set list with this particular story collection?
Well, I think they're in the same order. I can't remember for sure if they're in the same order as in the original volume. So the original volume, Family Album, was published in Spanish, and with the notion that it's this album, and so like a picture album, a photo album, and so the stories are named after different events. I actually ran into the stories separately. I had translated Gabriela's novel Pozo Wells, and with City Lights also published, and in advance of that, or at the same time, we were trying to place some stories in magazines, to help it have more legs. So I saw the stories first separately. I said, Gabriela, send me some stories you think might work, but then we decided, Gabriela decided really to put the City Lights as a collection, and we were going to include some other stories from a later collection, and if Elaine were here, she could explain her thinking, but finally we decided no, we would go with this collection as it was. So the curating of it as such was not really an issue, except changing all the titles back to the titles they had before we were trying to place them separately. I think that answers that question. It was interesting also that I worked on, so many people have talked about working on other works by the same writer and how that writer gets into your head. And, I was working on this in between working on 2 of her novels. So that also was all going on. So these stories are all based, as Gabriela says, on things that obsessed her from her personal experience or from journalistic investigations she did. They take place all over the map from Brooklyn to Buenos Aires, but Ecuador always appears in some corner of the story. And so there's sort of an outer story and an inner story that has something to do with adding up to a picture of Ecuador. In this story, a reporter stumbles on a mystery to do with El Santo, who was the masked Mexican wrestler and film star of the 1940s to 70s. And the reporter can't understand how he seems to have made so many films simultaneously in different places. And her investigation leads her to a former Venezuelan model and beauty queen now living in Ecuador, and to a story of impersonators and stand-ins and domestic violence. And I will read the end of that story. But what about you? I asked, surprised, my voice dwindling to a thread. Didn't you have any problems with that? She shook her head. which managed to douse a spark in her eyes. It seemed to be a question she had never asked herself. It gave me a purpose, she said suddenly. Isn't that enough? Doubt crept into her voice. You can't tell me you've never felt that, she said with distaste, as if chewing on tree bark, even as she closed her eyes and arched her back. Your heart racing, your breath heavy, your pupils dilated, everything coiled and ready to spring. She stopped. Nobody feels more alive than when they're about to explode. She smiled, but her eyes were closed off now in some realm of terror. I didn't want to keep listening. I didn't know whether or not this was the story I'd been chasing ever since I found that article in the claustrophobic basement that held the Diario de Mexicali archives. What I did know, the only thing I knew, was that what she had told me had the shape of an arrow, and that whatever I could speculate about its trajectory would only lead me to a target of my own invention. The distance between one thing and the other would remain there, devoid of an internal logic that only she could supply. That vacuum did not attract me, nor did the arrow, nor the path, nor the target. What I might do with all this attracted me even less. Let them all go to hell. After 8 years, the only thing I knew for sure was that El Santo was reproduced in an infinite hall of mirrors, and he held half the continent in his righteous grip. His opponents proliferated, his grasp extended farther and farther, and his matches mimicked real life. It didn't matter who was behind the mask, because the eternally deferred mystery was the answer to everything. Ask Miss Carabobo. Ask the producers, the investors, the packed arenas of North, Central, and South America. Or else, watch El Santo versus the kidnappers. All the keys are there. There's El Santo in Ecuador, saving the world from an economic crisis with an incalculable and irreversible domino effect. There's the premier national comedian, Ernesto Alban, drunk as a skunk, trying on the mask and being kidnapped because whoever embodies the myth becomes it. And then, of course, El Santo arriving the umpteenth time to save the day. The mechanism is perfect, the gearing precise, the house of cards fragile, and the story, who cares? It can pass for perfect.
That was wonderful. Thank
That
you.
was great. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dave.
And thank you all for being here and arranging this and everything.
Yes, that concludes the program for tonight. And I just can't thank you guys enough for the generosity of your time and your talent and just being here and sharing this event with us. It really means so very much for starting up a prize like this, our inaugural year, and you just never know what response you're going to get, and if anyone's going to be interested or, you know, respond to the request for submissions. And it's just been a thrill and overwhelmingly a big hug from all of the small publishers and authors and translators that we, as a bookstore owner and as an avid reader, that we just admire. So thank you all. And please stay tuned for the announcement of our shortlist on March 14th and the announcement of our winner on March 28th. Thank you so much.